I welcome Professor Maximilian Fochler. Just a short summary of his life, of his studies. He did a PhD on participating in which kind of governance, that was the title. So he did research on citizen perspective, on the concept of governments and public participation in the life sciences. And now he's assistant professor and head of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Vienna. And his main research topic is the broad area of science and knowledge cultures. And his talk is called, Why Don't We Shut Up and Contemplate More? So please, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. I come from a field, science and technology studies, who likes to think across boundaries, and I am affiliated at the moment at the platform Responsible Research and Innovation Academic Practice, where we try to kind of create spaces within an institution like the University of Vienna to kind of allow scientists to contemplate about their relation to society and their responsibility and things related to that. So I think it's really a remarkable achievement for a group of students to get together such an interesting symposium and fill a lecture hall with it. I think that's really something that needs to be celebrated, and I'm really, really proud to be a part of that. That said, the way this symposium is structured and the question that it raises inspired me to do two things in this talk, and I hope I will pull this off in 40 minutes. But I would like to give you two insights into two different questions. One of them is that I think this is about, and I think also the previous talk very nicely hinted at that, understanding how we and how the sciences might perceive the world in different ways and how that is related to the societies that they are related in their cultural context. And I will try to give you a few brief arguments about how my own field perceives this interface and these exchanges between science and society. And then secondly, there was something in the abstract for this workshop that so strongly resonates with a lot of things that I currently work on and think about, which was the quote that contemporary physicists, I think, but maybe scientists more generally, often feel too busy to really think, that I also want to share a few thoughts about. And that's also what the title of my talk is related to. What are the reasons that we might feel that there is too little time to actually deeply think in scientific work? Right, but first the question of the role of society, being the social scientist in the program, I feel kind of obliged to say something about that in the way that the different sciences perceive the world. And I have a few internal questions, for philosophers and sociologists and other scholars studying science alike on this slide. Don't be afraid, I'm not going to try to answer all of them. But there are questions like, and that was also very nicely, I think, in Professor Baraka's talk already, how do scientists arrive at the concerns that drive their research and the questions that they ask? How does a scientific field even recognize something as a discovery, as something that is even new? And kind of slightly simple comic I put up here is trying to kind of make a point in that direction. And how do sciences change the way that they explain the world over time? How do they develop? How do new theories come up? And Professor Baraka at the end gave a very nice example of how that can work socially by those that are associated with the old theories dying out in a kind of quasi-evolutionary model. But there have been also others and other explanations of that, and it might be interesting to think through that. And I will just briefly use two ancestors of my own field, if you like, the historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, and the molecular biologist and historian, philosopher, and a lot of other things, Ludwig Fleck, to show you two very different ways to think about the relation between, on the one hand, well, how do scientists conceptualize the world in a specific way? Which questions do they ask? And how is this related to the culture around them? And both of them have coined actually very similar term. Thomas Kuhn's term paradigms might resonate with many of you that have been thinking a bit about the history of science or the philosophy of science, in which he's basically trying to say something that I think resonates very well with the aim of this workshop also, which is to say, well, there are different perspectives, different very deep philosophical perspectives behind, sometimes even subconscious to the scientists that kind of do their work, that guide what scientists perceive to be important, what they think are important experimental questions, and what they would like, which kind of knowledge they would like to generate about the world. And that is very similar to Ludwig Fleck's concept of thought styles that was actually coined before Fleck's concept, and there's an interesting story here that I'm not going to relate about whether Kuhn half plagiarized this from Fleck without adequately mentioning it, even though he did mention it in his introduction. But that's not the story I'm going to tell. I'm going to tell the story that in one sense that really matters for what I would like to talk to you about today. These are very different concepts also, because they have a very different concept of what scientists do and how they relate to society. And Thomas Kuhn was an historian of physics, and he was very fond of physics. And as a social scientist, I have to say that he liked to make fun of the social sciences because he thought, physics is a kind of what he would call a mature scientific community, which means that they share one paradigm. And he thought the social sciences never got to that point until today. If he was still alive, he would still see that we share one paradigm, one basic approach of looking at the social world in our case, or the natural world in the case of physics, so that we are able to do what people can do in paradigms, which is nicely cumulatively add bits and pieces of knowledge to each other in a cumulative fashion that builds the kind of house of knowledge that he was talking about. And the interesting thing about Kuhn is that he's really interested in his scientists. When he looks at scientists, he talks about them really as people that are not too much interested in deep contemplation. He says they really like puzzle solving, right? They have their small puzzles in their experimental procedures, and they really like to work at them and solve them and add their little publications to the great house and edifice of science, so to say. So he looks at scientific communities, and scientists are part of scientific communities, but not many other people, or not any other people at all, actually. And his theory of how science changes is it's a bit more radical than Professor Baraka's proposal of those dying out in the quote. He talks about revolutions, but it's something kind of similar. There are silent revolutions and more violent ones. But he is interested in how one kind of way of seeing science replaces another from within science. Because he says, well, how do new ways of seeing the world in science come up? They come up because people get frustrated. Paradigms mature. There's no really kind of too much breakthrough anymore. There are anomalies that need to be solved, and at some point someone comes up, often genius, as he calls it, in the middle of the night with a dream and says, well, this is the new thing to do, and let's do it, and then there's a revolution and it happens. So that's in a kind of slightly very, very small nutshell, Thomas Kuhn's approach to the thing. Ludwig Fleck has a very different one, yet his concept of thought style is very similar, basically. But here's one that is much more intertwined with the societal context of sciences and how that influences the way they think. And particularly, Fleck's scientists are not only part of scientific communities, they are part of very different ways of thinking in and across society. And I think that's something when we look at the sciences today, and particularly at the responsibilities that scientists take, engineers and scientists being part of environmental movements and different other societal movements, that we can also very well recognize today. Fleck's individual scientists belong to very different thought collectives, and these thought collectives crisscross across science and society. And societal ideas and cultural ideas travel across the boundaries of science and society. And this also stimulates scientific change. So one of the things that Fleck claims is that a lot of times scientific change is, in very specific ways, also caused, of course, not determined directly, but has roots in societal interests and questions. So, to put this a bit provocatively and refer to what this symposium is about, Kuhn's scientists really are about, doing their work within the paradigm if they're not about to revolutionize something and contribute. And Fleck's are very much about the interaction with society and the inspirement that can come from that specific interaction. And, I'm not, and I'm the second one now to say that, I'm not at all an expert in physics. My work is on the contemporary life sciences, so I will also not pretend to be. But as in, Professor Baraka's very nice quote about fin de siècle Vienna, I think I have to pay a bit of a tribute to this whenever I'm in these buildings at the beginning of the 20th century around the University of Vienna, I feel I have to talk about this a little bit. And there's a very interesting book that is also in the Library of Physics, by the way, by an historian, by an American historian of science, that describes a family in late 19th, early 20th century Vienna, spanning different generations, including 2 rectors of the University of Vienna and a lot of famous jurists, physicists, neurologists, the Exner family. And what makes the book interesting for my argument is that what that historian does, what Deborah Cohen does, is she really traces how the concern that this family had of a specific worldview, a probabilistic worldview, crisscrossed their positions in society, but also in their different sciences that they were engaged with. In the sense of that one member of this family was engaged in revolutionizing secondary education in Austria based on that idea of having a probabilistic worldview that is opposed to dogmatism, strong causality, and other things. And obviously that is a position that is quite peculiar to that Austrian liberalism of the time. And it's also a story of a lot of discourse in coffee houses around the Währinger Straße, and in the Austrian version of Sommerfrische, where science and society interacted quite actively. Now, of course, we shouldn't romanticize these stories too much, right? So one of the reasons that professors sat around in cafes at that time is because they didn't have proper heating for their offices. But still, I think it's a nice story to get you into an idea of how scientific discourses, how societal discourses, societal concerns can shape the questions that scientists ask, and how these questions and their answers in turn move back to societal discourses. Right, so now let's zoom to the present day, because after all, the organizers of this symposium didn't invite a social scientist to brag around about history. So let me say a bit and a few things about the present day and things that I'm involved in and how I think they relate to that. So we have this buzzword, responsible research and innovation, and some of you might have seen at the beginning that I'm involved with a research platform that is working on that at the University of Vienna with the faculties of life sciences and social sciences. And that is a policy initiative too, and it's basically a policy initiative to, in different ways, for changing governance and other things, try to get science to behave more responsibly in relation to society. Now, of course, after my nice story before and all the kind of Fleckian inspiration narrative, you might ask, why do we need that? And actually, a lot of scientists do ask that question too. And how does it relate to scientists' practices in different fields? Aren't they already acting responsibly in many ways? Or is there something about this present moment in where there are systemic constraints that might keep scientists from reflecting on their responsibility, that might keep scientists from asking the kind of deeper and broader questions that this symposium is maybe also trying to put to the table. And that's what I would like to dedicate my second part of my talk to. And for that, as said, I'm much more at home in the life sciences, so I'll take you on a tour to the contemporary life sciences and their unhappiness with themselves in many ways. Because the life sciences are a field that in many ways is perceived by itself to be in a relatively deep crisis. So you have this paper here, 2014, Rescuing US Biomedical Research from its Systemic Flaws, that claims that the biomedical science that rapid growth in biomedical science has created an unsustainable, hyper-competitive system that is discouraging even the most outstanding prospective students from entering our profession and making it difficult for seasoned investigators to produce their best work, calling this a recipe for long-term decline. Now, if you know that, these are some of the foremost eminent figures of the US-American life sciences, at least, with Bruce Alberts being a previous editor of the magazine Science and director of the National Institute of Health, former director being included. That is a very strong statement. So there's a very strong sense that something is not going well in how research is being organized, how science is being organized in this particular domain. And I would like to follow their arguments and add some of my own to maybe provide some hypotheses that we can then discuss about. that might be related why we maybe have too little time to think. And two more quotes, because I think they are interesting from that particular paper. One is about what competition does. Hyper-competition for the resources and positions that are required to conduct science suppresses creativity, cooperation, risk-taking, and the original thinking required to make fundamental discoveries. So there's a deep concern here that there's a kind of superficial thinking being introduced by specific social and organizational changes within that specific scientific field that actually stands in the way of what science funding, and the organization of science is trying to achieve, which is making radical new and fundamentally new discoveries. And interestingly also, particularly because one of the authors is the former editor of Science magazine, they talk about the inflated value given to publishing in a small number of so-called high-impact journals, and the pressure it puts on authors to rush into print, cut corners, and exaggerate their findings, and so on, which is changing the atmosphere in many laboratories in ways that is disturbing. So there is a strong sense that there is an issue there with how science is organized. And I would like to add that competition is important, but when we look at contemporary universities, it's not just competition, right? It's also, we're seeing an increasing temporalization of research, because research is increasingly organized in projects, and people's contracts and careers are tied to the length of these projects. We are seeing new forms of measuring the quality of scientific work in quantified indicators, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. We see internationalization, and as the previous two things, internationalization obviously, and even more so obviously, is not per se a bad thing. It's a good thing, and we like to have international discourse in science. We like international competition, but it also creates, and particularly if it happens through things like university rankings, international comparisons, international competitions, it can also create isomorphism in the sense that the institutions become more and more like each other. We have an increasing individualization, particularly of junior researchers in their careers, but also of senior researchers, and in the sense that they are seen as strategic actors, and that success and failure is very much attributed to individual actors. And we are seeing a more and more narrow definition of scientific careers and normative patterns, of how careers are supposed to work, how people are supposed to work, how they're supposed to publish, when they are supposed to be at which stage, at which age of their academic career. And we can see that time and again in kind of ironic pieces. I can remember a brilliant piece being published in the Euroscientist a couple of years ago, which was stylized as a rejection letter of a grant funding agency to Einstein's proposal for his theory of relativity, because he did not fulfill all the quality criteria that we today believe scientific lives should have. So in relation to the thinking, and why don't we shut up and contemplate more? One of the things is there time to think? And I think time is very important, and that's also something that we, in our research platform, talk and work on a lot. First of all, in relation to projects which structure scientific work, right? In 3-year projects that, particularly for young scientists, often correspond to the time when they have to move on, get new jobs, and that means that also, the things that are to be done in these projects should be finished within these 3 years. They should be published, and that creates a pressure to move forward that has, consequences on the people, but also on the work they do and the questions they ask. And all of us in academia are exposed to an, I think, increasing repertoire of ways of being evaluated by citation counts, impact factors, teaching evaluations, and many other kind of rituals of evaluation that we take part in. Not least, I couldn't join this symposium this morning because I had to be part of a faculty evaluation. And we often feel, and that's a Finnish colleague has put that very nicely, that academics often feel that they lose what they call timeless time, right? So time that is not already dedicated to producing some kind of specific output, be it a paper, a specific result, a presentation, and something that could be made to count in the research activity documentation systems that we have. So the question then is, do universities shift from a logic of discovery to a logic of delivery, as another colleague has recently put that. And what does it mean when we think we should mostly deliver as many publications as possible, but not ask, what other kind of fundamental questions that we are actually trying to answer? So the first question is there time for thinking? The second question is, does thinking count? And I have talked about the metrics and the increasing normativity of scientific careers in these days. And particularly for young scientists in competition, but increasingly also for senior scientists who are also in competition for grant funding to keep up their laboratories, and so on and so forth. The question is, does what I'm just doing, does that count? Can I make it count? Can I transform it into something that works for me and helps me to do my work? And here we see a rise of increasing rise of quantitative assessment of academic work, which enables international competition. Obviously, it's there to compare scientists across different national contexts and work against specific forms of parochialism also. But if, and that is something that is quite often happening, and there are a lot of critical discourses about that, if the indicators are mistaken for what they should represent, so if indicators of quality and quantity indicators of quality get mistaken for the actual quality of research, then the phenomena of hyper-competition that the quotes from the life sciences I've chosen describe, they really kick in. And this also has, and we can see that across many fields also in the reflections of scientists working in these fields, this can also deeply impact what the content of the questions that are being asked and the knowledge that is being produced. For example, when quantity of papers and the rapid publication of small results, sometimes called salami publishing, which is a very fitting picture, is more important and better for careers than larger synthesis and reflection, or the kind of deep thinking that this symposium requires. And also the importance of impact factors and the focus on a small number of elite journals mainstreams a lot of the questions that are being asked, because it gives a lot of power to those that are in charge of the paradigms that are there at the moment, and gives very little chance for dissident voices to come up. And one of the reactions to this was that several Nobel Prize winners across the sciences announced that they would no longer publish in high impact factor journals, which by some was seen as an important sign, but by others, particularly junior researchers, this was also criticized as a stance that you can only take as soon as you reach a certain level of success. Right? And the last point is, of course, the relation to society that I touched on before. Can that be in any way be quantified? Can that be made to count? Is it time that is lost when we actually engage with societal questions and responsibility? Or is it time that can be made to count for a scientist's life and the way that their quality is assessed? So that's a bit of an expose of the broader changes that I think are there. So let me check, how many minutes do I have left? 15, that's perfect. Then I can give you a bit more of an insight into how people actually live with this and think about this, and give you some quotes from postdocs working in the Austrian life sciences. As you can see, that the life phase of a postdoc is, until now, has given rise to quite some culturally situated humor and cynicism sometimes. And when you talk to postdocs in the Austrian life sciences, these always are very dedicated people, right? They choose to do scientific careers, and they choose to do scientific careers even though they know that they will face an incredibly intense competition for very few permanent academic positions. They know they have to be mobile. They have to go from one postdoc to the other, 2 to 3 postdocs being kind of the compulsory and necessary thing. And at every time, they will be assessed, because a good postdoc is a good card for the next postdoc and maybe to transitioning to a more permanent faculty position. And all of this is centering around the ability to succeed in the competition that this quote before also talked about, based on productivity in acquiring internationally accepted tokens of academic quality, publications, and grant money. So what does that do to the way that people think and the way that people plan their lives? That's something that for the last years, together with a number of colleagues I've been concerned with in my research. And I'm giving you the first quote here by a male postdoc. It's all postdocs from Austria, though they might not be Austrian, but have come here from international origin to do their postdocs. It says, the higher you are in this hierarchy, the more competition you can field. We fight for money, we fight for being first. And it's a measure of success in science, the number of citations that you can get in this fight for being first. And this constant fight and the feeling that very few will succeed in this fight produces something in biographies. And that was one of our informants called this, well, basically for the postdoc period, which is quite long, as I sketched before, you start to log out of life, of personal relationships, but not also of personal relationships, but maybe also societal debates. And interestingly, when we compare postdocs and PhD students in the life sciences, we notice that PhD students, they talk a lot about, what they would like to achieve with their research in curing diseases, contributing to societal challenges. And it's not that this is not important to postdocs, but this intense focus on careers that they have to have somehow puts this to the background quite strongly. And even sometimes we had the feeling that when we talk to them, it even becomes a resource much more than an aim in itself, a resource for them to kind of continue being productive in the race that they feel themselves to be in. And that changes also how people live and work together in science, how they relate to their colleagues, how they feel to be part of a community. Because, and that's particular about the life sciences, I have to add, and it's different in many areas of physics, at least as far as I know. The life sciences are an incredibly individualized knowledge production culture, where it is very important that results, that epistemic results, are specifically attributed to senior and junior researchers, respectively, in the orders of authors and publications. So there is a certain calculation going on, as you have in this quote also. When you work together in the lab, it's always a question, where you're going to be on a specific paper, what is going to come out of it. So intellectual sociability, is not a value in itself, but a resource for being productive. And of course, in a certain way, it has always been like this in science. But these exchange relationships and these calculations are very, very strong when you talk to postdocs in the life sciences. And something that science and technology studies is deeply concerned with is always not, and of course we care and we want to know how people kind of feel about this and live with it, but we want to know, what does this do to the research that they are doing? Does this relate to the decisions that they make about which experimental models to work with, which questions to ask? And the interesting thing is, when you talk to researchers, it strongly does in many ways, because experimental models are chosen in ways that allow people to produce results in a specific time frame. Some questions are seen as more sexy than others in terms of, that funding might be attracted for them. They might be attractive for high impact factor journals. So as the quote here describes, when people move up the career ladder, it becomes less and less a question of, what they're actually interested in, but more and more a question of, what can be done and sold within a specific system. And there a risk comes in, the risk that is extremely strong for the researchers that we talked in, because as you know, every kind of research is uncertain, particularly basic research. And in the life sciences, you never know whether an experiment is going to work or whether you will have wasted 6 months on something that cannot be made to work. And the problem is that with this strong career pressure and this strong individualized culture, this epistemic risk, this risk in the experiments, becomes synonymous with the risk to make a scientific career. So if your experiment doesn't work, then your likeliness to do a scientific career is decreasing. And of course, people have risk matching strategies to kind of manage that specific problem. But it also means that there's a certain conservatism in the questions that are being asked, and a lot of kind of hedging, and that also societal questions and concerns move to the background a lot in the questions that researchers ask. Right. I will slowly start to kind of conclude this also, because I'm really looking forward to discuss this with you, and curious to kind of, because I am so deeply rooted in the life sciences in my research, how this is seen by interdisciplinary audiences in a physics context also. What are the conclusions from this? I've tried to sketch a picture here of, and I've only hinted at some very important changes, obviously, but I've tried to sketch a picture here in which social and organizational changes in science, particularly also in the way we organize universities, we organize careers internationally and nationally, I think cut the space for scientists to reflect. And there's a danger that this can turn science onto itself in endless competition games like the ones these scientists in the life sciences were describing, rather than opening it to the things I think this workshop is concerned with, societal engagements maybe on the one hand, but any kind of deep thinking on the other. And this has consequences. One of them is that we can see for researchers in highly competitive areas, and that relates to the biographical stories that I told before. We are seeing workplace health issues increasingly. And we also see a perceived loss of meaning for scientists that tend to burn and be fascinated in their work. But at some point, and I've for quite some time also now studied people moving out of science and doing their research in different institutional contexts than academic science. And many of them gave us a reason that just producing one paper after the other at the fastest pace possible was just not what they were interested in producing knowledge. So how do we get back to thinking more? And that is something that, as I said, we also try to kind of find out together with our colleagues in the life sciences in that research platform. And I think, again, to play on the title of the symposium and knowing that, of course, that is not what the organizers had in mind. But shutting up definitely is not a solution. That should be clear. But on the other hand, it's tricky because it's a highly complex situation. And I think my talk also tried to hint at that, these problems are rooted in factors that are deeply institutionalized and ingrained in the way we do science in the science system, in careers and institutions, in the way universities are governed. So institutions and collectives need to play a central role here. They need to take responsibility for how they use, for example, quantitative indicators, how they assess people's careers when they employ them for academic jobs or faculty jobs. But it's also important, and that's why symposia such as this one are so important, it's also important to have researcher initiatives. Initiatives of young and senior researchers that try to think academia in different ways, and there are a couple of impressive examples of that across the world already. There is the slow science movement, there is the science and transition movement in the Netherlands, which is quite strong. So really interesting examples that try to think science in different ways. There are different kinds of movements against the dominance of the impact factor in evaluating scientists. So this is very important, and I think talk is something that is needed to move forward, particularly because also one of the things that I experienced in doing fieldwork in the life sciences is that these individualizing tendencies that I've talked about in careers and otherwise tend to insulate academics from each other. They tend to put them in competitive relationships that make it harder to think about more collective solutions to these problems. And that's what we are doing at this research platform, and I will end my talk with a bit of advertisement and invitation to also maybe look at what we do. We do things like this nice card game that we play with scientists that help them to reflect, when they have time to think, which structural constraints there are to the way they think and where they can see their societal responsibility. We regularly organize workshops on these topics that are open to everyone interested in the University of Vienna and beyond. So if you're interested, feel free to get in touch, drop us an email, there's also a mailing list. I would like to thank you now for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion.
So thank you for this interesting talk. We have now 14 minutes for questions.
May we change our places? Can I come there and you come here and sit there and maybe I can talk?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just talking here. Okay. But in a different positions, yes? Okay, so I read this event and it was called Shut Up and Contemplate. Okay? So it means that we talk a lot and we want our subjects, our like colleagues or whatever we call friends, understand us, okay? And we talk a lot, like we describe who we are. For example, I can start that I'm a bronze medal of physics competitions of Iran. And I can speak 10 languages involving painting and piano playing, okay? It's kind of a language. It's like 12 languages. And with deaf language could be 13 languages, okay? So it means that I'm very good in linguistics, okay? But I can say it as a student or as a professor, yeah? But what's the matter? What's the difference between these positions? Why can't we really communicate with each other? Like, why can't we really communicate with each other? Like, I didn't care about what he talked because it was very cool and I didn't get it because I'm not intelligent enough like him. But I want to be him maybe one day. Not me, maybe one of you. But that's not my problem. What my problem is that how even professors communicate with each other, okay? So I care about movements before languages and the way that we connect with each other, okay? And that's why I just picked that chair, I jumped from there, and I pretended kind of that my leg hurts. And that's why I just sit there and just observed you as my subjects, not my professor. Of course, I respect him with all of my heart, but what I respected was also you, all of you, like all of the faces, and I just kind of measured the differences in aesthetics that I made between curved lines, and I just pay attention to the lines and movements. And how, okay, one more minute, okay, and how we communicate with like static, like the structures, okay, and how it could affect our perception. And even I looked that they both discussed with each other. He maybe had problems with speaking with different dialects, but he wanted to convince that he has right, but there is no right in the way of finding the truth, I can say, because truth is not just in one point. It can't be. And we kind of want to believe these hallucinations that science really could change something, and we investigate in NASA, go to the space and conquer the world. But we even haven't made it to the Mars, people. Open your eyes. And this is the reality that is solid, and this is just a hallucination that is solid. That's it.
Thank you. Professor Fochler, you want to comment on this?
Well, I think there were two very nice points about this. You know, the one is the difficulty of establishing communication across disciplines, obviously. But that is, I think it's important to just start and do that. And I think that, yeah.
Well, we had one more question here.
Yes, thanks. I found very interesting what you said about life science, and I guess we all believe that the same problem holds for probably almost every other science. So my question is, I have two questions. One is, you said almost nothing about possible alternatives. So what shall we do? What should be changed in science except for having some, say, activities that are organized by certain groups inside of science? How should the institution should change? And I mean, against the background of I mean, let's play a little bit of the Advocatus Diaboli. I guess there is an obvious reason why we have this competitive situation now. And the reason is, at least in Europe and in Austria in particular, that we had a system a couple of decades ago which was completely protectionist. And so there was no competition, and if you was a professor, you didn't have to publish because you was a professor, and in order to get a professor, you just have to know to get in touch with your professor, and you get protected and so on and so on. So this system is nothing that anyone wants to have now. So what is the alternative? And yeah, that's it. I mean, is there a way out of the dilemma of this extremely competitive scientific world that doesn't lead us back to protectionist structures nobody wants to have?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. It's an excellent question, and I think I would like to give two answers that are on different levels, and I think they're both important. I've been thinking about this also related to my own field, and I think the swing that you describe from this very kind of parochial way of hiring to this what we have now, to this hyper-competitive one, is it's a very good observation. And I think what is important, at least what I try to strengthen in my own field, is that we need a more substantial concept of what quality means for us, right? Because I think in both of the opposites that you described, the one that is basically based on knowing people and having the right relations, quality is defined in social relations, and in the system we have now, quality gets defined in a very reductive, indicatorized way. And I think the way out of this for single fields is to kind of really get together and think about what counts, and this is about the kind of deeper thinking that is also important, that the symposium tries to kind of, I think, relate to, because a field needs to reflect what do we actually want to achieve and which questions would we like to ask and what do we want to reward in relation to that. And I think that's really crucial. But for that to happen, and that is my second answer, we need institutional conditions that enable us to do that. And a lot of what is fueling this is the fact that scientific institutions are partly in reaction to what you have been describing, but also in systems that have worked in very different ways, are kind of retracting from taking responsibility also for the careers that people that develop within these systems. So they're creating a lot of temporary adjunct faculty, reducing the number of actual faculty positions, creating a lot of uncertainty also in people's lives and biographies. And that makes it very hard to have this other kind of discourse that I think is very important. And I cannot propose any kind of radical alternatives because I think they have to be developed out of a discussion that is at the moment starting with a lot of initiatives. I've kind of tried to touch on many of them. But in the end, the way the science system is developing is a kind of real-world experiment that we can kind of try to kind of guide in one direction or the other.
I will make an effort to ask an actual question and be concise. So your outline has been rather pessimistic, as I understand it. Therefore, I wanted to know, are there also positive consequences of this development, and are there counterexamples? You mentioned the life sciences a lot. Are there also fields where things work better? And is everything about this development you described, is everything bad about it, or are there also positive consequences to it?
It's a very good question, thank you. There are clearly positive sides, in the sense that, of course, and that has been mentioned, right, that the way that we now are able to define and compare quality works against specific things that were there in the sciences before that were also deeply documented. And also, for example, the rise of project deployment at many universities. Of course, it creates opportunities. So the story of the life sciences is one of exponential growth, right? So a lot of money was poured into the life sciences, which created an enormous amount of opportunities for young people to work in that domain that wouldn't have been there if this money hadn't been there. The problem is the transition from this kind of growth process to a more stable thing. So I think, and that's why I also wouldn't like this to sound as a kind of entirely pessimistic outlook. There are many positive changes also in the way that this works out. But I think there is a large danger there if we kind of trust too much in some of these systems of evaluation, and if we buy too much into this temporalization and competition games, that can also create quite some pathologies. And in relation to your question, is there a field for which this is working out well? Well, I would say I have to discover it yet, but in the sense that, of course, some fields profit from that, right? Some fields, particularly if I take the social sciences as an example, have a better fit with the dynamics of quantification and this way of working than others. And other fields of knowledge production might have less so. But I'm not sure that this profiting in the short term is actually, what people see as a profit in the long term in terms of how their field is developing and in terms of the question that it asks.
Okay. Just a short question and remark. Do you feel that the professionalization in... Here I am. Okay. Do you think that the professionalization in science, which started actually in the 17th century to some extent, leads slowly or in an exponentially increasing tempo to the situation that we have now? We have almost non-existing amateur science at all. Which was not the case in the 19th century. And before, most of the science was amateur or hobby-wise science, where you are not restrained by institutional economic issues and so on. So isn't it a little bit utopic to think of how to change the institutions in order to produce this? Is it the only thing? I think that the issue of, because you said it was said, interest is growing and so on, but I think that from what you say, much more weight is going on the economic issues, on the social issue, and so on and so on, but not on the core of the science. And yeah, that's my main question is, do you think that it is still possible, or we could do some effort to revitalize amateur science? For example, teachers could do this. No teacher at all does science now. I mean, relevant science, and so on. And we had examples like this. Not only teachers. I mean, that's the only thing. So why should science be only professional? Of course, one can think of laboratories, but you can make a kind of access to laboratories which could be also accessible for amateurs, and so on. So just issue to think about it.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very interesting proposition to think of this in terms of professions. I mean, I agree with you to a part. I'm not sure I agree with the picture of amateur science in the 17th century, because these amateurs mostly were, rich gentlemen that could afford to do that specific form of science. And many of the institutions that we have today, even in science, grew out of that specific social status of those people. Nevertheless, I think what you say about professions is very interesting, because one of the things that sociologists say about professions is they usually have an audience, right? Doctors have patients, lawyers have clients, and the question is, who's the audience? Who's the audience of science? And I think when I was talking about science turning onto itself, it is scientists being the audience for science, right? And a lot of recent commentaries have asked the question, well, don't we need to think more about the other audiences? And don't we need to kind of think about then also which other kinds of knowledge production there might be in society, as you alluded to, and how we can positively kind of relate them to what scientists do? In that sense, it's a very good question. Yeah, thanks.
A very short remark, non on your talk, but parallel. It is generally not known that Cuba has developed a modern, advanced biological industry with a different structure from the Western, not capital intensive, in which the choices were finalized to the needs of the population. So instead of the responsible principle, there was a social, a direct social engagement, and it's a non-competitive scientific community.
Thanks. Yeah, I take that as a kind of very important point, that comparison is always important. And I think that's also in relation to the colleague's point before, you know, do we think that institutions can change? And I think for that it's very important to look into how things have been institutionalized in different cultural contexts, in different phases of history. And when I talked about that, you know, tricky term isomorphism, I was trying to express the worry that kind of through international university rankings that we tend to imitate, universities across the globe become much more and more like each other, and that we lose particularly that diversity that is so important as a kind of repertoire of how to deal with things. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for all these talks, for all these questions and for your talk. We will convene in half an hour at 4:40 for our last session.